Hello there, folks, and welcome back once again to Southbank Live, our weekly YouTube broadcast where we discuss the latest events in the markets and some of the undercurrents which you may have missed in the news. My name is Boaz Shoshan, and I'm joined once again by John Butler. We've plenty to be discussing this evening. I thought the French election would be a good thing to focus things around, but we will be dwelling on quite a few other topics as well. So it has been quite an action-packed week, as so many weeks of recent memory have been. John, how are you getting on this evening?
Very well, thank you. It's a beautiful, beautiful spring evening here in the greater London area.
Yeah, it's been good to get some decent weather at last. It always feels like a surprise every year when the weather starts getting better. Good evening to everybody who has joined us for this live broadcast. It is always nice to do these live, and do feel free, of course, to leave your comments and any questions in the chat. Good evening to Andrew, straight off the bat. Hi Boaz, hi John. Trust you're both well. We are indeed, Andrew. It's great to be hosting these and discussing the current events. Would be interested, of course, in everyone's thoughts on the French election this show as well, as it does seem to be quite a critical one. Just to start off with, though, John, on a light-hearted note, I thought we could do our long-short segment first. Just to be clear to everybody who has not watched these before, this is not financial advice. This is purely an entertainment segment, as it were. So this is just to look at the news or look at the markets over the past week and select something that you would be long at the minute and something you'd be short, or bullish and bearish. John, what would be your long short for this week?
Well, starting with the long, I think you might be aware that there's been a bit of a retracement in the precious metals in recent days, which, in my view, is understandable in certain ways and less understandable in others. I mean, if you just look at the sharp rise in bond yields that we saw, then you could say that made precious metals relatively less attractive as stores of value. And yet that sell-off appears to have lost a bit of momentum, and yet the risk aversion appears to have ramped up with what some people believe is the greatest escalation yet to date in the Ukraine conflict. A variety of things have happened, and yet precious metals have been beaten up recently, very recently, I stress, and disproportionately silver. And so I think now is an opportunity to get in. Silver does tend to underperform on the downside vis-a-vis gold. And so when you get these sorts of corrections, silver tends to be disproportionately beaten up. And we've seen that here. I think it's an opportunity to get into silver as a metal that is not regarded as a safe haven, and yet, depending on circumstances, can be seen to nevertheless have safe haven properties on the one hand. On the other hand, silver, as we know, has a wide and growing range of industrial uses, some of which are absolute cutting-edge technology in medicine, in various forms of renewable energy, it's a huge range because silver is conductive, it's reflective, it has the highest electrostatic charge of any of the non-radioactive, relatively inert metals. And so that's a big deal, right? Anyway, I think silver's the long. The short, well, I tend to pick on big tech, as I call it. But big tech, in some cases, is not quite as big as it used to be. And the most recent casualty there, as we saw earlier this week, was Netflix, which came out with some extremely, extremely disappointing results and got absolutely hammered, deservedly so. In the market following those results. But in my mind, you can generalize this point. Okay, fine. What they said, of course, is specific to Netflix. And yet, what's really happening here is all the expectations around the value of all the intangibles, the brand value, the momentum, the market share, these things that sound great on paper, but are difficult to quantify in practice. Well, this week we saw that intangibles are not always what they claim to be in valuation terms, and Netflix has suffered a huge, huge hit as a result. I think that if you generalize, and I think you should, this is a warning to a lot of other tech firms, big tech firms, that they may be suffering from a lot of hype, a lot of expectations around the value of their IP, the value of the brand, the value of these intangible assets, as it were. And then maybe this is going to spark a general reassessment. That's kind of what I'm getting at.
Yeah, so kind of like canary in the coal mine, but in this case,
Possibly.
an absolutely enormous canary. Yeah, very interesting to see how quickly the worm has turned on Netflix. Very sudden indeed. One of the things I learned during Lent when I wasn't boozing was the just how poor the quality of Netflix's own productions are. You really can't watch them unless you're consuming alcohol, or at least in my experience, it was like you have to pair this with booze one way or another. So hopefully this gets them to clean up their act a bit and start producing some quality content. On the long short side this week, mine are quite closely connected together. So it is the Queen's birthday today. Long live the Queen! So I think I'm going to be long the Queen, and but to keep things quite tightly hedged, I'm going to be short ginger members of the royal family, and
Oof.
I won't elaborate on that any further. I'll let our viewers draw their own conclusions. We do have some very interesting content chat already, actually, and this is from Liam. Evening, Boaz and John. Good evening, Liam. Tesla shares soared this week, but they said on the radio when Volkswagen and the rest catch up, they will be stuffed. John has been highlighting this for months. I wonder, John, when you're talking about Netflix being canary in the coal mine for the big tech sector as a whole, and we at the same time have this big drama with Elon Musk, CEO of Tesla, trying to take over Twitter at the minute. Today, he unveiled his financing plan for that, including, I believe, $21 billion of his own money, supposedly. I do wonder, do you think Tesla is going to be maybe the next one to fall, or is this the final domino to fall in the event that we do see a big crash over the tech sector?
I really don't know, but I would say that I think Tesla is very vulnerable. I mentioned this multiple times. I believe that the idea that other automobile firms and other firms also involved more generally in battery tech and other aspects of what Tesla does, some of them have a lot of expertise, a lot of smart people working very, very hard. And the idea that Tesla's brand value is going to allow them to outperform, outsell, and outlive all of that competition at much higher multiples and margins than that competition really flies in the face of what I believe that the history of somewhat competitive capitalism looks like. It's exceedingly rare for a company that far ahead of other companies that share the vast bulk of the same technology, same expertise, to retain that lead indefinitely. And yet, that's really what Tesla's relative valuation tells you. It's kind of like Coca-Cola. Again, I use Coca-Cola as an example. Coca-Cola is an extremely well-run company, but the idea that there was never going to be a Pepsi, there was never going to be, competitors to Coca-Cola. Of course, they sprung up. Some of them didn't survive, but some did well. And that doesn't mean that they are better than Coca-Cola, but in relative valuation terms, a lot of them came a long way. And I think that Tesla has got, the sort of lead that a horse sometimes has in the Grand National that may look very impressive for a time, but just isn't sustainable in the longer term. And so that's what I think we're looking at here.
Yeah, very interesting. It's a very interesting situation. Even though big tech has been such a big, long-standing investment theme, it is very old in the tooth indeed, or long in the tooth indeed. And yet there are still always these. It's impossible not to be fascinated, I find, with some of the sectors, because it is ultimately about progress of some degree. It's not just the same old process. It's not like, there's development in every sector ultimately, but it's not something so direct as, say, commodity extraction, where it's just the method of extracting the commodities and where you can find new commodities is the sort of the excitement comes from. Perhaps with the tech sector, because it's limited only by imagination, that's one of the reasons why investors have become so fascinated with it over time.
But this is what I'm getting at, is that I have nothing against the concept of intangibles. Tell a company that really has discovered its own special IP, intellectual property, secret sauce, as some of us call it. And they find ways to spin that into myriad innovative products that catch the public zeitgeist and achieve, in some cases, almost a monopoly of market share for a whole new product range for a sustained period of time. Yes, these things happen. And yes, investors can and should always be on the lookout for such opportunities. But when I look around, it's almost as if the entire market is driven by that mentality now. And I'm concerned, and I've been concerned for a long time, about the more traditional skepticism or lack thereof present today. And I think that the whole thing has run away with itself as a trend because it's sexy, it's cool, it's green, it's the future, almost without asking questions. And when you stop asking questions, you stop being a good investor. And I kind of feel like a huge portion of the market invests passively nowadays
Yep.
and has ended up chasing this trend in a way that has resulted in a general overvaluation. It doesn't mean the technologies aren't real or exist, but the idea that they will become effective monopolies indefinitely may be overstating the case.
Right. That's a good saying, John. When you stop asking questions, you stop being a good investor. I think I'll hold on to that one. Would love to hear your long short for this week from everybody watching this live, or indeed, if you are watching a recording of this, leave it in the comments. The question does come from Jane asking, am I short Fergie then, the Duchess of York, as she is ginger? Quite possibly, Jane, quite possibly. Stephen says, your shorts have something in common. Netflix has hit the skids since they added a ginger dimension, which is, very interesting, Stephen. John Tooth is long global warming, global warming, long bikinis as a result, which seems like fair enough trade. And it would be very interesting to hear everyone's thoughts on their long and short for the week. Doesn't need to be something very serious. You don't need to spend an awful lot of time thinking about it, but just think of the news items and what you're currently seeing and give us a long short from that. Now, our first topic of the evening, we shall be getting on to quite a few different wide-ranging themes, but the first one is the frog in the room, the French elections here. Is Le Pen mightier than Macron's green sword? There is a headline here I thought we could start with that illustrates an aspect of the upcoming election. Macron vows to end fossil fuels use in pitch to green voters. This is from Bloomberg. President says he'll appoint minister to plan the transition, and this is quite overtly going against Marine Le Pen's her angle at the minute. Now, Macron is a very interesting politician in that he can appear to be all things to all people. There was great. Somebody did a great political compass a while back where they attached a quote from Macron for every different quadrant in the compass, going from full fascist to full communist, full libertarian, etc. Because he's managed to get broad appeal and appeal somehow to every different, almost every different angle of the electorate, or at least he did, back in the late 2010s. Going forward, though, John, what do you think is going to happen? Do you think he is going to lose his green luster or his broad appeal?
Well, that's certainly possible, but one cannot deny he's been a very successful politician. France, as with many countries, it's not just France, but has very sort of, in some cases, odd political orientations. The way in which left and right work in France are a little bit different than they work in certain other countries. Part of that's due to the imperial legacy. Part of that's due to the disproportionate influence of legendary figure Charles de Gaulle. And so it's difficult for a French president to not try to appear at least a little bit Gaullist, and yet you try to do it without appearing old-fashioned Gaullist, as if you're, neo-Gaullist, if that makes any sense. And so the left-right spectrum in France is affected by this in a way that other countries aren't. Keep in mind, France's constitution was basically written by de Gaulle. He created the Fifth Republic, the current constitutional entity known as the Republic of France. And one of the things he did was he created a very strong presidency. And he created a strong presidency largely because he felt that the Fourth Republic descended into chaos because the presidency wasn't strong enough and the parliament was too strong and got stuck in all kinds of partisan infighting. And there was no proper leader who was able to weigh in against that, someone elected directly by the people with a general popular mandate. So that's the context in which this is happening. Macron is obviously a political chameleon, as you've pointed it out. And yet I think it's interesting in this case what he's doing to suddenly make a last-minute big appeal to green voters. I mean, how does that work? Because it's at this point now, it's him versus Le Pen. There's no point being a chameleon when you know exactly who at that precise point in time now your opponent is. And does he really think that somehow winning over the Green vote, which presumably Le Pen couldn't win over if she tried, is that really wise? I think it's just odd that he would try that now, as if the Green voter would suddenly think Le Pen was the one they favored. That tells you something interesting, though. Keep in mind what happened at the first round of the French presidential election, which famously occurs in 2 rounds. The far left candidate did surprisingly well. And Macron's fear is that some unusually large portion of that far left candidate's support is not going to go to him, but all the way across to the far right, because both of them have become economic, political populists vis-a-vis what is seen as an inflexible centrist regime that doesn't listen to the people, that doesn't allow them to protest, that imposed what some believe were outrageously stringent mandates during the COVID crisis, which have conveniently now been rescinded prior to the elections. So that, I think, is the only explanation for what he's doing. You'd think he would have won the Greens over long ago because they're associated with the left. And yet he fears the left is going to go all the way over his head to the right in this election. That, I think, is what's going on. And that is why the polls may be wrong. It's why we could get a surprising result this weekend. It could happen that way. It is this weekend, I believe, right? So it could happen that way. And indeed, we've seen similar surprises in recent years. Brexit was a surprise. Trump was a surprise. There have been a handful of smaller country surprises. And maybe this is going to be a big European surprise.
Quite. I mean, Macron himself was something of a surprise, though not as surprising as someone like Le Pen would have been, I suppose. I do wonder if it's possible for us who weren't born and raised in France or French territories to ever truly understand the nuances of French politics, as it seems so alien relative to British politics and things like that. But John, if we do imagine that we do get a big surprise, Marine Le Pen gets in, what do you think is going to happen? Do you take some of the rhetoric regarding NATO, France withdrawing from NATO seriously, and some of her very Eurosceptical views? Do you think that's something that she would take with her into office?
I think she would in principle. What that would end up being in practice could be very, very different. And I suspect she wouldn't be quite as rash as she's come across in her rhetoric. But look at precedent here. There is precedent for her perhaps being somewhat rash. De Gaulle himself, again, legendary figure who she claims to emulate, he's the one who took France out of NATO's central planning back in the 1960s. He never said, I'm no longer an ally of the West in the Cold War. Of course, I'm an ally of the West in the Cold War. He agreed the Soviet Union was the enemy. He just felt that France should do its own military planning and not allow that to be subservient to NATO's central military planning. And he created an independent nuclear force, which indeed was a triad. That is, he had aircraft that could carry nuclear weapons. He had ICBMs that could carry weapons to the Soviet Union or anywhere in the world, for that matter. And he also built a submarine fleet. He did everything he could to make France a de facto nuclear neutral power in Europe, as, again, don't get me wrong, not an enemy of NATO, but able to act in its own way to serve its own national interests. So there is a precedent for Le Pen to perhaps find a way to behave in a bit more independent, neutral way vis-a-vis other NATO members, and also vis-a-vis other EU members, because, of course, she uses similar rhetoric vis-a-vis the EU. She looks across the channel at Brexit and she's envious. Why shouldn't we be allowed to redefine our relationship with the European Union? Whether we outright leave or not, open question, but she might well want to redefine that relationship. And I think there is a precedent there for that sort of thinking also. So if she wins, she will see it as at least a mandate to seriously pursue those two ideas. Whether she actually goes all in all at once, less likely, in my opinion.
When you think of France economically at the minute, incredibly heavily indebted. This is something that during when people look at the Eurozone in general, they often see Germany and France as together these two key stakeholders in the Euro project and almost see them in a similar light. But when it comes to the finances, France is incredibly heavily indebted relative to Germany. And I wonder whether or not, with rising interest rates as we're now seeing, with rising bond yields as we're now seeing, whether or not this might become a very poignant problem for whoever wins this election going forward, where previously they've kind of just been able to keep borrowing, using the emergency as a backdrop to it. And then it was COVID, and now they'll use Ukraine and the energy crisis as the next big excuse. But do you think this could end up becoming a really big problem for France?
Well, I mean, look, it already is. Okay. The idea that you could have a national debt that large that isn't a problem. Now, it may not be the biggest problem or the most pressing one, but it is. It has become a problem. And the question is very much how it's going to be dealt with going forward. I mean, you could make the case about not just France, but most European countries that anyone who takes power today is inheriting a poisoned chalice,
Yeah.
a chalice of a huge national debt. And what are they going to do about that? Okay. France does have certain advantages. And indeed, in the current context of the conflict in Ukraine, which is causing a European energy crisis, actually, that kind of improves France's hand to play a little bit because they have all of this excess nuclear generation capacity.
Right.
And when you look at the military angle, they also have what I just mentioned, an independent nuclear force that can be used as they believe a deterrent, hopefully used in the way they think will best deter any foreign aggression. And so when you think about Germany's relationship with France, and Germany is in the front of that energy crisis because they don't have the excess generation capacity. They have almost no nuclear left. They're hugely dependent on Russian gas, as we know, and they have no nuclear force at all. And their military, in a historical comparison, is, let's be nice about it. It's not great. I could say something very derogatory about it, but it's nothing like what Germany used to have in terms of military capabilities. Now, some people think that's a good thing in general, but in this specific instance, many people are thinking, gosh, it would really be nice if Germany had a bit more to bring to bear in this conflict if necessary. So there you go. Maybe France and Germany have a deal to make here, where Germany goes to France saying, hey, our economy has been strong, but now we're facing this huge energy shock. We're not going to be as competitive. We're not going to be able to carry the rest of the EU unless you maybe help us solve our energy problem by diverting, some more energy our way with your excess nuclear capacity. Maybe there's a way to work that angle. And then on the other hand, and perhaps more importantly, given the escalation that's occurring now, maybe Germany and France could surprise everyone by letting the world know that they're having high-level discussions, or letting it leak out they're having high-level discussions about under what conditions France would consider a certain violation of Eastern Europe or Germany itself as a reason to extend the protection of France's nuclear umbrella to include those countries. Now, that's hugely speculative, but I see a certain logic there.
That is very interesting. John, when you're thinking of the market reaction to a surprise in the form of Marine Le Pen becoming the French premier, what do you think that would actually look like? Because we've already seen European equities get their asses handed to them already, and then beforehand during the COVID crisis, and they've been so weak for so long. You have to wonder when there is going to be some kind of change in trend, and this is going to become a growth story again. And so, suddenly French companies are going to become the flavor of the month again. But it does feel like a very long way off. Maybe that's an indicator that actually this is something that will happen imminently. But how do you think markets would react to Le Pen? Just the announcement. Macron's lost, Le Pen's won.
I suspect there would be a sell-off. I suspect the euro would get hit. I suspect French equities, and for that matter, European equities more generally, would get hit. And indeed, we saw knee-jerk sell-offs when Brexit surprisingly went through, when Trump was surprisingly elected. It seems that the investment community at large, they kind of like the status quo. And there are legacy reasons for that, because the status quo, take the current generation of investors, say that on average, most of that investment is being directed by people with, I don't know, 20 to 30, maybe a few more years of experience. These are people who have ridden this wave of ever increasing fiscal and monetary stimulus being thrown at everything. Whenever there's a downturn, the taxpayer's on the hook. Well, gee, if you're an investor, isn't that nice, right? You're the beneficiary of all of
Yeah.
that largesse, which is, of course, at the expense of the common man. But if you're a wealthy investor who can position yourself ahead of the curve there, you're benefiting in each and every instance. And so I believe that this investment community has this component, which is very, very large nowadays, which just likes that. They like knowing that fiscal and monetary stimulus is always going to have your back. And when you get one of these fundamental disruptions to that, and Le Pen, I think, would be perceived that way, as questioning whether that should continue, then yes, you get a knee-jerk sell-off. Whether it continues, well, in Brexit's case, it didn't. In Trump's case, it didn't. And in Le Pen's case, should she be elected, it might well not. But I suspect that would be the knee-jerk reaction.
When you hear, I think it's quite telling of just, it feels like a desperate move to simply label your opponent as an enemy of the country or an enemy of the state. And we've now seen that this sort of reversion to, below the belt kind of allegations and mudslinging in the form of, you're on Putin's side. That's why I've got to win. We've seen that recently with Macron and Le Pen. With Le Pen's stance, do you think that she would be what would she do that would be so pro-Russia if she were the premier? I mean, there's plenty of things you could do when you're French. When it comes to arms, for example, as the French military is very, very developed, you could withhold arms and things like that, and you could maybe lobby the Germans to be to just keep on accepting the gas. Not that they need any encouragement. But do you think there's any weight to that? Because Macron, has been described by David Murrin, who I interviewed recently for Southbank, as the Putin whisperer. He's made himself very much he likes to think of himself as an international man who can bring these crises to a halt, or at least do something about them. What do you think? Do you think there's any weight in Le Pen somehow being on side with the Russians to a greater or lesser degree?
I mean, look, I don't think there's any evidence for that. All I'll say is that labeling your rival as, in bed with, beholden to a foreign power is one of the oldest tricks in the political book. I mean, that goes back forever. I mean, you can read about that in Herodotus and Thucydides and the great Roman historians too. I mean, come on. I mean, this has been tried time and time and time again. And that doesn't mean, by definition, there's no truth to it. But my God, I mean, the vast majority of the time, if you look back in history, no, it's frequently made up out of whole cloth. Evidence is manufactured, or it's spun so far, it just makes no logical sense anymore. And I given how this is so last minute and desperate, it certainly, to me, looks like it's a purely political angle rather than anything that's well grounded. Now, that said, you can legitimately believe that were Le Pen president, it would not serve the national interests of France, and that, yes, she might choose to try and, I don't know, I mean, warm relations with Russia somehow, and you're not in favor of that. But to say that means she's in bed with them, I think is just political expediency. It's Macron grasping at straws. I'm sure some high-placed, very qualified people who read political tea leaves have told him he's really got to go there now, or he's in danger of losing this election. Yeah. And again, I think the best explanation for why they're doing that is because the far left did incredibly well in the first round, and they fear a number of them are going to go right over Macron's head to the far right and seal victory for Le Pen in this one.
It does feel like a desperate move. And to do so late in the game as well, if you genuinely had conviction in it, it didn't really make a huge amount of sense to me. Looking at the comments, a lot of people are well, Northumberland is short Macron, while long his wife / grandmother, brackets, sort of a hedge, as he'll never leave her. Meanwhile, Stephen says, never trust a man who marries his grandmother. Not a huge amount of fans for Macron in the chat tonight this evening, folks. But, this is simply reflective of the Southbank Live viewership, I suppose. End of the World says, does Bernard Arnault care? It's so quiet in Europe. That's a very interesting observation. Bernard Arnault, the wolf in Kashmir, as I believe he's known, the CEO of LVMH. And you'd imagine he's a huge power broker in France. Would you comment on that at all, John? Do you know if he has any political ambitions or he wields a lot of political influence?
Well, he's kind of like the Earl of Warwick used to be during the Wars of the Roses. He's the kingmaker. And the last thing you want to do when you're the kingmaker is actually become king yourself, because you actually hold a lot more power behind the throne when you're in the position of being able to switch the existing king for another one if they're not doing your bidding at any given point in time. That is, you're playing one side off the other side from behind the scenes, which also removes you somewhat from public scrutiny. I mean, look, this is a very smart guy. There's a reason why many people believe, although it's very hard to do detailed calculations about some of these things, many people believe he's the wealthiest man in Europe. I think it's hard to really know what people are worth when it comes to that level of wealth, but many people think he's the wealthiest person in all of Europe. And so that could be the case. In any event, he's on the short list for the wealthiest person in Europe. And he's incredibly savvy in all aspects, business, politics, you name it. I would be horrified to think he wasn't somehow involved in what's going on here. My guess is that he's doing what he can behind the scenes to try and uphold the status quo. That said, who knows? Maybe he feels that France is now going in the wrong direction. Maybe he feels someone does need to rock the boat. Maybe he feels, as many, big German industrialists did back in the 1930s, that something had to change. And therefore, they were even willing to support someone as outrageous as Hitler. Now, I don't want to compare Le Pen to Hitler, but you see what I'm getting at. There is a time and a place when powerful, wealthy, industrial people are willing to roll the dice because they just think the existing leadership is just not taking the country in a direction that will continue to generate wealth.
Yeah, well said indeed, John. We shall return to the Ukraine crisis later on in today's show. Though at the minute, I would like to return to actually bring up a chart, which I thought we could discuss, which is quite an alarming chart, I would say. We just hold on to this for a little while. So this is, for everybody watching, this is called the MOVE Index, and it sounds very complicated, and it's quite esoteric, and it's quite conceptual in a lot of ways. But just in terms of what it is, this is the volatility or the expected volatility of US government debt. This is measured using the options market. So it takes take a look at the standard deviation in prices on options on US government bonds, and that will get you the MOVE index, the Merrill Lynch Option Volatility Estimate Index. Sounds very, very very wordy, full of it's alphabet diarrhea pretty much, but it is a very, very important chart. It's a very important index. So if we're looking at the volatility of US government debt, what we're thinking of is kind of the stability of the asset at the base of the global financial system. US government debt is still viewed as one of the core forms of capital and the deepest, most liquid market in the world. And this forms the basis for banks throughout the world, even outside of the US, because it's just such a great asset to have, or at least so the financial system thinks. And this is a chart of the volatility of it. Now, you do see a massive spike at the beginning of 2020, but that was when volatility in everything blew up. Since then, I found this rise that we've seen in the MOVE index, it's not actually been spoken about a huge amount by the financial press, and yet it really is quite accelerated, and we're not seeing a similar rise in volatility elsewhere, like in stocks, for example. So that's the MOVE index, and I thought we could discuss what's going on there, what could be behind this destabilization at the base of the global financial system, Joe.
Well, it's a very worrying thing indeed, because the fact is that if you study finance and valuations and the relationship between interest rates, bond prices, equity valuations, multiples, and so on and so forth, the thing is that the bond market, especially the so-called risk-free government bond market, risk-free because people assume it can't default, that's the benchmark against which everything else is measured. it kind of represents the speed of light in an Einsteinian universe. That is, if you can't relate gravity, time, and other concepts back to the speed of light, they don't actually make sense in an Einsteinian universe. So that is a big deal when all of a sudden the benchmark, the thing against which you measure everything else, is getting unstable and volatile. By implication, it means that valuation assumptions for riskier assets, corporate bonds, corporate equities, various kinds of structured products with perhaps very complicated payoff functions, all of these things are going to become more difficult to value. As things become more difficult to value, other factors equal, you have to put up more capital against those positions to protect against a possible loss. And that's certainly true if you have a credit line from a bank, because the bank will see the volatility increasing and they'll start to say, well, hey, you definitely have to put up more collateral or we're going to cut your credit line. As a general rule, these are the sorts of things that tend to happen early on in financial crises before the big headline prices that people tend to watch begin to really respond. This is, as you said earlier, a type of canary in a coal mine. Okay. But this coal mine is arguably the biggest coal mine in the world. And if this one caves in, blows up, whatever it is going to completely reprice everything. And I mean everything. If people demand more capital simply to hold treasuries, they're going to hold disproportionately more capital to hold any asset against just pure cash. And that could, of course, lead to a run out of assets into cash, which, as we know, is what was happening when things really got going back in 2008. So it is a warning sign, and it's definitely one worth watching.
Yeah, really quite grave indeed to use those words, John. What do you think it is that's actually causing this?
Well, I mean, look, the Fed, which of course has a huge amount of control over the US Treasury market, the Fed is finally telling you that inflation's a problem and they are going to do something about it. And this is the first time the Fed's made that sort of statement. They may not have much credibility anymore, which is being a bit skeptical on my part, but okay, fine. It's still the first time they've made that sort of statement, that point blank, since the early 1980s. It's that big a deal. You had a couple instances in the early 90s, but really, this is arguably the biggest about face that we've seen since the early 1980s. And that scares people. It should scare people. And it doesn't just scare domestic investors, it scares the whole world, as you say. The dollar is the global reserve asset. Those reserve assets are not only held in short-term instruments, but also longer-term bonds. And everyone is concerned now what this means, what's really going to happen. The Fed's no longer quite as predictable as people thought it was, at least temporarily. So yes, the bond market is extremely nervous here. That means people are probably provisioning for additional capital to provision against that perceived increase in risk. And that can become a self-fulfilling prophecy because it sucks liquidity out of the market because people need it to build these hedges as opposed to establishing new positions. And this is this sort of environment, as Warren Buffett, has famously said through the years, it's the sort of environment in which the tide is going out and you might just learn who's swimming naked.
It is a metric which we're not seeing a huge amount of fuss about at the minute.
Not yet. Not yet. Early days.
Yeah, and in 2008, in that chart that we saw, it was only the past few years. In 2008, it did go much, much, much higher than that. But to see it approaching the levels that it reached in 2020, when everyone did think the world was falling apart, and there's not really any one individual cause that is being pointed to as, oh well, that's why this metric is so high, makes me think that there's something afoot there. We do get plenty of good comments here in the chat. Good evening to Natalia and to AJ and Edward. It is great to have you all here. There are now. I think for our next segment, I think we could go on to the Ukraine crisis and what's going on in Germany at the minute. Just to tie into that, do get a good comment from Robert, who says de Gaulle, referring back to our conversation on France, de Gaulle was correct, did not trust NATO, brackets the USA, to go to war to defend France. Look at the worthless guarantees made to Ukraine in 1992 when they ditched their nukes. Trust no one ever, your pound and dollars included. Very good comment there, Robert. It does feel like history would be an awful lot different had the Ukrainians not given up their nukes in 1992. What do you make of that, John? Do you think there could have been a different path, or was it inevitable that Ukraine would be disarmed?
Well, look, the Soviet Union imploded much more rapidly than people expected, and the United States probably assumed by the Gorbachev era that the Soviet Union's days were numbered. But then when things finally did come apart, they came apart very, very quickly. And I remember this because I was a student in the U.S. at the time, and I knew some people at my university, professors, who were involved in the U.S. national security community. And indeed, one of them was a prominent Sovietologist whose job was to try to read between the lines of internal Soviet communications that were intercepted and figure out just what they meant. Now, he wasn't CIA, for example, and yet he knew people who were, and so on and so forth. And look, nobody would have ever told me anything too saucy. I mean, I didn't have a security clearance or anything like that. But the mood, I can tell you what the mood was like when I spoke to these people. They were absolutely horrified at the prospect that as the Soviet Union imploded, there would be some loss of centralized command and control over the Soviets' vast nuclear arsenal. And priority number one was keeping that intact under a single central authority at all costs. And so when Ukraine, among other countries, of course, Ukraine simply being the largest, began to break away, and understandably so, who would have wanted to remain part of that sinking ship, right? Let the lifeboat go at that point. Obviously, Ukraine thought, well, gee, we have a substantial portion of the Soviets' military capabilities on our soil. Shouldn't we be allowed to take that with us? And the mood of the U.S. was absolutely not, right? We don't want to try to go through that because, well, there's just all kinds of nasty places that could have gone. Anyway, the legacy of that decision is with us today. You could argue that at the time, the U.S. felt it was making the right decision, but now, obviously, Ukraine lacks the ability to credibly defend itself in this situation without the NATO backstop. And that, of course, draws NATO into the conflict because clearly most NATO, if not all NATO members, have been Ukrainian independent supporters from the get-go. So you end up now with a very messy situation, which is a legacy of that previous decision having been made the way it was so urgently. It's not, there's an old saying, almost anything is easier to get into than out of. And this applies to many things in life, and it certainly applies to this situation. I don't know what the solution is. Russia has made clear that Ukraine not being part of NATO is of vital national interest, and they will and have gone to war to prevent that. I do believe that there is a basis for negotiation here where Ukraine declares some form of neutrality, but that may not be good enough for NATO. That might not be good enough for Ukraine itself. It could be that people will decide that when the Soviets drew the borders of present-day Ukraine, they drew them in a place that included too many ethnic Russians. And maybe it makes better sense for that border not to be drawn in quite the same place so that Ukraine is a more ethnically homogenous country as opposed to the very deeply divided one it's been over the past couple decades. Look, I don't know what the solution is. All I know is that World War III is probably not the optimal one. And I really, really hope we find a way out of this.
Quite right. On topic of solutions, AJ in the chat says, let's face it, the best thing that should happen is for a James Bond style agent to go shooting Putin ASAP. Right. Well, AJ, I think that would make a great climactic scene in a movie or a great level in a video game. But I think you should be very, very, very careful what you wish for. I don't think that would. I think that could go wrong in any number of ways, and plenty of them include lots of mushroom clouds on the horizon. Now, we do have a couple of headlines I'd like to take a look at here on the Russia situation and how it ties into markets. So this is from the US Treasury Department saying that the Russian their sanctions on Russia will not fragment the global economy. Deputy Secretary points to the multilateral nature of the economic actions taken against Moscow. And the next one is regarding, I believe it's on stock market listings. Yes, Putin calls time on foreign listings in fresh hit to tycoons. Billionaires use New York and London stocks to collect foreign exchange dividends. And that's from Bloomberg. Couple of interesting themes there. The first one there with the US Treasury Department saying globalization isn't under threat after they launched this enormous economic assault on Russia. It does feel like they would say that. Don't worry, guys, everything's going to be fine. We're going to be okay. Don't worry about us doing this, because obviously, if they said, "Yeah, actually, globalization's done. Party's over, guys. Sorry, we did it for Russia. We had to do it." You can't imagine them saying that. And on the second headline there, regarding you've been pretty bullish on Russian stocks, John, given the inflation and the commodity element to it. With Putin saying you can't have your stocks listed abroad, that does change things a little bit. It's hard to imagine a lot of investors rocking up to Moscow to waltz through the exchange and make their plays there. Just wanted your thoughts first on the state of globalization and the US Treasury saying that it's fine, because I don't feel like it is fine. I feel like they're just saying that.
No, it's not fine. They are just saying that. I mean, it makes no sense at all. And they have to do so for political reasons, obviously. You need to say that, because if you say the opposite, then of course everyone who is going along with you with this sanctions policy is going to say, well, what the hell? I mean, what is it you're trying to achieve here? And so the US has to pretend that they can do this, and that the sanctions will only harm the targets thereof and not those who are the ones implementing the sanctions. That's just how the sanctions game is played. And that's the politics of it. But the economics of it are very, very different. And sanctions are never one way. Absolutely not. And in this case, I think when you look along all dimensions, one could certainly regard them as being at least somewhat counterproductive, if not wholly so. And on the other one about the saying multilateral, I mean, multilateral is whatever you claim it is. The same way when the U.S. decided to invade Iraq, they talked about this coalition of countries. Well, that coalition of countries may have sounded impressive to some people, but if you looked at a map of the world, you actually found that most of the world had nothing to do with it, and it was really just a few countries that took part. And yet they call it this, big coalition.
Yeah.
Well, in this case, you can do the same thing. If you look at a map of the world and look at the countries that are indeed imposing sanctions on Russia in line with what the U.S. has been pressing for, and those that aren't, an awful lot of the world isn't, and that includes some very, very large players such as China and India. And so, look, it's politics. Okay, there's almost nothing to that statement that is true.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Good to hear. Good to hear your thoughts on that, because it does seem quite a ridiculous statement to make. Looking on the side of Putin calling back Russian companies that have equity listings elsewhere, this does feel like yet another move. Similar to, we're only going to sell energy for rubles. If you want to buy Russian stocks, you're going to have to come to Moscow. It does feel like there is this sort of grand retreat, or not retreat, probably the wrong word, but grand economic stepping back of Russia, and making it clear that if you want anything from Russia, you're going to have to go there. What are your thoughts on that, John? Because it does change some of your some of your longs over the past few episodes have been on Russian equities. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, this is not directly related to my reasons for that. My reasons for that were more general macro reasons. With respect to the actual resources available, and the fact that I believe that critical resources will always be in demand. You'll always find a buyer somewhere, and I felt the Russian stock market didn't reflect that at all fairly. This is different, but this is in Putin's mind. This is a totally rational response to what has happened in the world, because Russia is being cut off from the rest of the world. And so to allow wealthy Russians and the companies they control to still have foreign listings where they generate profits through foreign activities and can squirrel those profits away into foreign bank accounts, and I mean, completely without uh, any tie to Russia at all whatsoever. I mean, from that perspective, it's almost as if they're playing ball with the United States and other countries imposing the sanctions and trying to do so without any penalty, even though ultimately their wealth derives from Russia. So I can see why Putin is doing this. I mean, once the gloves come off in war, almost anything goes. And I don't think this is the sort of thing that Putin would have done necessarily had the sanctions war not escalated to the point that it has. But it has, and this is just the next logical move, or one of the next logical moves on his part.
A couple of interesting comments here regarding that move index that we shared earlier, where there is this emergence of volatility from the very core of the financial system. A couple of interesting comments here regarding what might be causing that. So Seamus says, when the US began with quantitative easing around 2008, they tried to convince China that the value of their dollar holdings would not be affected. Their envoys were laughed out of the country. And there is a bit of speculation from Northumberland, who suggests perhaps this rise in volatility in the bond market is from China selling their bonds. And of course, China has a very large holding of US government debt, which it's accumulated over time. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, John, but because China's holdings of US Treasuries, unless they've got some really shady offshore stuff, we're talking about the official holdings. I think they're owned by SAFE, isn't it? The Chinese subsidiary for owning their foreign exchange reserves. That's all public declarations. I mean, when you buy those bonds, you have to say that you're the owner of it, and these are published by the US Treasury Department, who is the owner of the bond. So if China were to start offloading a load of those bonds and causing a lot of volatility, for example, which would be expected in the move index, we would know about it, right? Because the disclosures have to come out relatively quickly after you sell those bonds.
Yes. Now, that said, China could try to be clever about it, and they could try to sell to entities that appear to be just neutral international investment entities that are nevertheless somehow controlled by China still, and maybe think, oh, gee, the U.S. isn't aware of this, or whatnot. I mean, there are things like that can sort of take place. For example, people who understand the SWIFT system understand why there's a disproportionately large amount of US Treasuries held by Belgian banks, because those banks are foreign-owned subsidiaries that are the direct link in Belgium to the SWIFT system and facilitate the liquidity of the international payments thereof back to wherever their home market is. And there are also entities in the Cayman Islands and other Caribbean jurisdictions that are related to some of the world's largest hedge funds and not just hedge funds, but other investment groups who do so to be in neutral jurisdictions where they can also funnel holdings of U.S. assets back and forth and around without direct scrutiny of who the ultimate owner is. Loads of that stuff goes on, and it does. I mean, some of it goes on for tax, avoidance and whatnot, but some of it may go on for other purposes, including political ones, where you honestly don't want people to know what it is you're actually doing. So there are layers, right? There are ways to layer these sorts of transactions throughout the international financial system. Now, you'd like to think the Fed still could kind of see through that. There are people who work for the Federal Reserve whose job it is to try and see through that because they want to know what's really going on. Yeah. And at the highest level, even the CIA is involved in tracking what might appear to be flows in U.S. assets abroad, holdings thereof, that could be ultimately traced back to entities perceived as ones that are enemies of the United States, or at least potentially acting against the U.S. national interest in some way. So look, it's difficult to know. I will say this. If China were ever to try and liquidate its holdings of US Treasuries in size, we wouldn't be having this conversation. It would just be too obvious. If they were really doing it in big size, it's the sort of thing you can't disguise in scale. It's just the scale's too big. Too many people will be involved. Too many people will find out. There's no way they'll be able to keep it secret for more than 48 hours, and it will blow up the current international monetary system because China holds such an unbelievably large amount of those reserves. And once a player of that size in this game shows their hand, then everybody shows their hand, and the game is over.
Damn. Well, when you put it that way, John, it sounds like quite an event whenever it does happen, if it does happen.
If it does.
To which we do get the question: why hasn't China sold all its bonds yet, following Russian sanctions? I believe that is from Robin. Good question, Robin. Why haven't they? But my gut instinct would be, well, they don't want to appear to antagonize the US in such a manner, as it would be an act of economic retaliation, though maybe not an act of economic war, simply to sell the holdings, and would be a very definite signal to the rest of the world that we are anti-American now. What would be your thoughts on that, John?
Well, look, you don't push a falling tree. I believe there's a perception in China that they're the rising power, that the US is the declining power, and if the US is going to follow policies and make decisions that are perhaps not in the US national interest, such as an overzealous sanctions policy, which undermines the dominance of the dollar in the international monetary system, does China really need to add fuel to the fire? Now, they do need to protect themselves, absolutely. But the best way to protect yourself is probably not to overly disrupt the existing system, but to do sensible, clever things around the margin to prepare for that possibility. Because someday somebody is going to push the tree. An unstable system is eventually going to move into some direction of a more stable system, right? Gravity is the ultimate force of the universe, according to some people. And if you have to find a lower center of gravity to remove the pressure and tension and everything else, that's where this is going. So I think China is, as you say, trying to appear as neutral as they can in this, which they are so far, in the sense of just saying, hey, it's got nothing to do with us. And I'm not surprised by that decision. As far as under what circumstances they might choose to do something disruptive and liquidate Treasury holdings, believe me, were the United States to try and impose anything similar on China for any reason, be it aggression against Taiwan, aggression in the South China Sea more generally, guess what they might well do? And yes, it would be disruptive, and it would hurt everybody, including China. But once you decide to go to war, you kind of expect disruption.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it, John. We are getting on for time this episode. We are reaching the end. However, this has been great as ever, John. It's been a very, very wide-ranging conversation here. Do get a couple of questions if you've ever considered running for Chancellor of the Exchequer here in the UK, or Bank of England Governor. Ever passed your mind? Maybe put in your CV at Threadneedle Street.
Look, I don't think I'm a serious candidate for that. I think my views are too controversial. And the fact that I'm not a naturally born British citizen, but rather an American, I think does not put me on the short list for those sorts of positions. That said, I have had honor is probably too big a word, but I have had the fortunate occasion to be able to provide pro bono advice to a handful of MPs in recent years, which in a few instances did enter the formal Hansard record of Parliament, both in committee hearings and speeches on the House floor. And so I have tried to make my contributions to the policy debates in this country because this is my home and this is where I'm raising my children. And so I do take it seriously. And so, yes, I've been fortunate to be invited to offer my thoughts on several matters in which I thought I had something to say. And so I'll continue doing so, but I doubt it will ever culminate in such a prestigious role, such as one of those.
Well, you get my vote, John. I definitely, I think you'd make a good Bank of England governor or Chancellor of the Exchequer, for that
Thanks,
matter.
Buzz.
I think, and I think plenty of our viewers would as well. We shall be just a quick heads up, folks. Before we do finish for this evening, we shall be having 2 episodes of Southbank Live next week. There's a bonus one we'll be doing on Monday. While John will be taking a holiday from Southbank Live next week, but we'll be back soon after. So on Monday, I'll be speaking to Sam Volkering about what's going on in the crypto world. And on Thursday, I shall be speaking to David Murren as a follow-up to our interview that's also on our YouTube channel regarding what's going on on the geopolitical angle and what he thinks the British government should be doing. Now, in the meantime, thanks to everybody who has tuned in for this live show. It is great doing them live. It's great to interact with the chat and speak to you all through this stream. And of course, thanks to John. This has been a great chat as ever.
Oh, my pleasure, Buzz. Until next time.
Until next time, indeed. Bonus points to Robin, who in the chat, when I asked for what the long short, everyone's long short was for this show, and following John's long of silver, Robin put in long John silver, har har. Very good indeed, Robin. Bonus points. That's all for the minute, folks. Hope you enjoyed this. If you're watching a recording of it, do give us a like and subscribe. That really helps us out. But until then, we'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.